Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 13 in our course on drugs and behavior. This week, we'll actually be talking about a class of legal drugs, um, and that is dietary supplements and over-the-counter drugs. Uh, so dietary supplements and over-the-counter drugs we talked about a little bit quite a number of weeks ago in our coverage of drug regulation, because the distinction between drugs and dietary supplements is important. So we'll go into more depth this week on those topics and what exactly those drugs are, not just what the laws are regarding them. So it's a long name, but we'll be covering regulations a little bit more in depth. We'll be treading some of the old ground just to refamiliarize you with what the laws are regarding dietary supplements and over-the-counter drugs. Uh, and we'll also talk about the mechanism of action when this information is known. Now, especially when it comes to dietary supplements, some of these are natural products, and we don't even know all the ingredients. And in fact, the manufacturer is not required to list all of the ingredients. There was a legislative push to do so a few years ago, but it was actually defeated. Uh, so most of the time, for the natural products, we don't know what all is in there, which makes it obviously difficult to assess function, to assess effectiveness. More on that in a minute. Also, we'll talk about some of the positives and negatives. Now, some of the compounds, especially in over-the-counter drugs, we're already familiar with. Things like caffeine, other stimulants, other depressants. So this will be familiar ground to some degree. So we'll be focusing on what makes an over-the-counter drug over-the-counter as opposed to prescription-based. So this session in particular, we're going to be focusing on the dietary supplements. Uh, your book conveniently sort of splits down the middle on this chapter. So today we'll talk about dietary supplements. Next time we will talk about over-the-counter drugs. So we'll go over the history. Again, some of those we've already seen in our coverage of the laws on things like patent medicines. Uh, and then we'll talk about the current regulation on dietary supplements. And then we'll look at some of the famous examples. There are lots and lots. Most of them, there's no evidence they do anything. Uh, but there are some famous ones, and so we'll go over those. We'll also go over some supplements that are probably best avoided. So we'll get right into it. Because I'm recording this lecture earlier in the week, I don't have a chance to respond to discussion from last week. I will respond to those discussion questions after Thanksgiving break. So if you remember from quite a few weeks ago, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act created the FDA, and it was concerned not so much with effectiveness, but with safety and purity. And so these are laws that require the labeling, the accurate labeling of ingredients. So there was oversight to check whether the ingredients really were what the label claimed they were. And so that was really the main push, was the correct labeling and the purity of ingredients, making sure there weren't contaminants getting in there. And of course, this was all aimed at safety. If you don't know what's in the patent medicine, uh, then it's hard to know how much to take, hard to know what you can take it with, and hard to know what exactly is in there if you have special medical conditions like cardiovascular problems. Should I take this patent medicine? Uh, and so these laws really moved the bar forward in terms of making products safe. Uh, but it wasn't required that they be effective. And this is a tradition that carries over into our current regulations on dietary supplements. And here's a picture from your book. There are lots and lots of them. We'll go over just a few. But they don't require proof of effectiveness. Uh, and so that's really the big distinction between drugs, over-the-counter drugs, and dietary supplements, is that there is no proof of effectiveness, and there's a restriction on what a dietary supplement manufacturer can claim the supplement does because of that. So you can't claim that a supplement does something when there's no proof that it does it. Also, modern dietary supplements have to include a disclaimer to the effect of this product is not designed to treat or cure any disease or condition. So there are a number of different regulations for dietary supplements, but in the end, they are chemicals. They are substances that are taken into the body, uh, presumably, so they have some effect on physiology. So the legal distinction between dietary supplements and drugs, over-the-counter drugs, is a lot more solid than the biological difference. And in fact, for many of these substances, for many of these dietary supplements, it would be hard to say why one is a drug and one is not. Now, more recently, the FDA has uh, put forth some new rules. For example, they have published a list of allowable claims. So, for example, if the supplement contains calcium, uh, the manufacturer can claim that it's good for bone health, prevents osteoporosis. If it is low in sodium or uh, contains other compounds like certain oils, uh, you can claim that it's good for the heart. But you still can't make the claim that it cures a condition or that it's meant to treat a disease. You can just make a claim that the contents are helpful for certain body systems, basically. There was also, in 1994, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or DSHEA. And this provided several changes in how dietary supplements were handled. So what did this do? So first, it expanded the definition of what dietary supplements are. So before, they were just things like vitamins and minerals, and now they include oils, other compounds. So it really significantly expanded what was considered a dietary supplement. Perhaps more importantly, there was a shift in what we call the burden of proof. So with regard to safety, before the DSHEA, it was incumbent upon the FDA to prove that a product was unsafe. That is, the manufacturer could put out a product, and if the FDA studied it and proved it was unsafe, then that product was pulled. The DSHEA shifted that burden of proof, so now it's upon the manufacturer to prove, to give evidence that the product is safe, but there's no significant risk of taking the product. And so that might sound like a minor distinction, but it is important because the FDA has an enormous number of products that it has to deal with. We'll get more into this next time. And that puts some of the burden on the manufacturer. However, this legislation also relaxed the standards for effectiveness. So really, there just needs to be evidence the claim could be true. So if there are conflicting studies on whether a supplement works or not, that's enough to claim that a supplement can help with a certain physiological system in the body. So it's as long as there's some evidence that it works, that's good enough. Also, this is later on, but as sort of an offshoot of the DSHEA, that there are oversights now in place for the manufacturing processes. Now, these are dictated by the manufacturer, by the producer of the product, but the FDA does spot check to make sure that the procedures the manufacturer has said they're going to adhere to are actually adhered to. So the FDA still has that oversight, even though the procedures aren't dictated by the FDA, they're dictated by the manufacturer. Also, this was approximately 10 years ago, the FDA created a mechanism to report adverse events. As I mentioned, the dietary supplement manufacturers have to provide evidence that the product is safe, but those studies don't have to be all that comprehensive. And of course, even if you perform a comprehensive study for the safety of a product, that's not definitive proof that it is safe. We've all seen commercials for class action lawsuits that sometimes it takes a really large sample to demonstrate what some of the adverse effects are. So after the DSHEA, but still in the same sort of family of legislation, there was a mechanism now in place for reporting those adverse events, so that if it actually ended up being the case that the product was unsafe, that the FDA could detect that. So as I mentioned, there are lots of supplements. Uh, Most of them are harmless. Some of them may be effective. There are some you probably shouldn't take. And so this is a condensed list from your book. There's, for example, aconite, which is used traditionally in both Asian and European medicine. Uh, but it's not safe. It is actually toxic. Whether or not it provides the benefits that it's supposed to, it seems like the downsides outweigh the positives on that one. Bitter orange and country mallow, for example, both basically contain ephedrine-related compounds. Um, and as we'll see, ephedrine has some negative health consequences as well, particularly for the cardiovascular system. It's been implicated for cardiovascular problems, for stroke in particular. Uh, so those supplements are probably best avoided as well. Most of these also don't have a demonstrated benefit, or at least not one that is better than available over-the-counter drugs. Colloidal silver. Silver traditionally is thought to combat infection, but there's actually no evidence that it does so. And it has a lot of negative effects as well, particularly for the kidneys. Then you have metals like germanium. And germanium is an element. It's not a biological product. It doesn't come from a plant. It's just an element. Um, and it doesn't seem to do much of anything either. Uh, some people claim that it fights cancer, but studies have not shown that to be true. Um, and it has negative health consequences as well. So these are some supplements that if you were thinking about buying them, probably best not to do so. So there are some examples that are safe and then of arguable effectiveness. Um, and the safe here is a relative term, so relative to the table we just went over. So for example, St. John's wort, which some of you wrote your papers about for paper number 1, is typically used to treat anxiety and depression. So it's thought to be sort of a natural antidepressant. In terms of the evidence, the evidence is mixed. There is some evidence that St. John's wort is about as effective as a tricyclic antidepressant, which is not the most effective class of antidepressants, but it is legitimately useful. And so there's some limited evidence that St. John's wort does actually help with depression and anxiety. However, St. John's wort also has some dangerous interactions. And so, especially with other SSRIs, those serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors. So you get what's sometimes referred to as serotonin syndrome, where St. John's wort plus an antidepressant that basically acts by the same mechanism can sort of be overly effective, can do too much. And of course, serotonin does things more than just regulate mood. It also regulates things like body temperature, and it's important in sleep cycles. So you can have too much of a good thing. So St. John's wort should not be combined with other antidepressants. There's also ginkgo biloba, which is famous for coming from East Asian medicine. Several of these compounds hail from East Asia, and there's been, over the last few decades, an increase in interest in alternative medicine, particularly East Asian medicine. Now, for ginkgo biloba, again, it's traditionally used in East Asian medicine, and it has been demonstrated to have effects on clotting. It is basically a blood thinner. Now, the question is whether it helps with memory. And that's usually the claim with ginkgo biloba, is that taking it will improve memory. And studies have shown limited evidence. It's very, very small effects, if any, for ginkgo biloba, even in those with Alzheimer's disease, for example. So whenever you have a drug study that's supposed to improve memory or improve circulation, improve clotting, all of these things can be studied in healthy individuals to see if they improve memory, for example, if you already have a fine memory, or to see if you can overcome a deficit, if you have Alzheimer's, for example. There's really, again, very limited evidence that it affects memory, even though it does affect clotting. And because it affects clotting, it should not be taken with things like aspirin. Again, we have a drug interaction where we have multiple medicines, even if one is a supplement, that basically do the same thing physiologically, you should probably avoid taking those together. And again, here we run into this distinction between the difference in legal terms between dietary supplements and over-the-counter drugs, but physiologically, your body doesn't care what its legal designation is. If it thins the blood, it thins the blood, whether it's a dietary supplement or an over-the-counter drug. Of course, there's Ma Wang, which we've already run into in our stimulant chapter, because it contains ephedrine. And as I mentioned, ephedrine has been shown to have a cardiovascular effect, can increase the risk of stroke, so it's no longer available. It hasn't been for about 10 years. Now, lots of medications that depended on stimulants use things like caffeine instead of ephedrine because caffeine is safer. It's also true for weight loss supplements. A lot of weight loss supplements in the 90s and early 2000s had ephedrine, but it was discovered to be unsafe, and so now they typically have caffeine. Some other examples, these aren't really gone into any depth in your book. Ginseng, which is another East Asian traditional medicine plant. So there's limited evidence that ginseng helps with memory either, just like ginkgo biloba. However, this brings up an important point because it's hard to study long-term effects for things like dietary supplements and herbal medicines. Why? Well, because it's a long-term study, so you can't isolate someone and keep them from going about their daily lives. And people who are interested in taking herbal supplements usually take more than one. And so it's very difficult to isolate just the effects of ginseng, for example, because people tend to take, if they take any, tend to take more than one of them. And so that's really one of the things that makes it difficult also because people that take dietary supplements, herbal supplements, tend to be more health conscious, even though the supplements themselves may not improve health. The fact that the person is interested in their health usually means they're doing other things to take care of themselves. And so it's hard to, again, isolate the effects of the supplement when the person is doing other things that might account for effects on memory or other health outcomes. And finally, we have melatonin, which many of you may have heard of. So melatonin is actually a neurotransmitter. So it's a specific molecule. It's in the serotonin family. And it's only released by what's called the pineal gland, which is part of your brain. It's only released at night. And so it seems to have something to do with your day-night cycle, your biological clock, so to speak. And so it has been shown to be effective as a sleep aid, but mostly, for example, if you switch time zones, it's good for jet lag. It can help you fall asleep earlier than you otherwise would. But it's not good for chronic insomnia, for example. It only seems to be effective in the short term. There have been claims raised about the effects of melatonin on fertility and on preventing the effects of aging. There's really not any evidence for either of those, partially because we just haven't studied it much, but also because, for example, melatonin does increase fertility in certain animals, but those animals are seasonal breeders, so humans are not. And so obviously, human females have a monthly menstrual cycle. It's not seasonal. They don't have estrus like sheep, for example, do. And so the reproductive system is on a different schedule, so to speak. And so melatonin doesn't seem to affect the reproductive system in what is considered a normal dose. And in fact, in higher doses, it may actually suppress the reproductive system. As for aging, it's thought that melatonin may have some antioxidant properties, but again, it just hasn't been studied enough to demonstrate effectiveness. There are medications. This one is marketed under the name Rosarim. So it is not melatonin itself, it is a melatonin mimic. So it's a melatonin agonist. And again, this is for things like jet lag or short-term insomnia. Okay, so that will cover it for dietary supplements. Next time, we will look at the other half of the chapter, so over-the-counter drugs. So we'll look at what defines an over-the-counter drug. Why are some drugs over-the-counter and some you need a prescription for? We'll look at some of the recent regulations, so the laws governing over-the-counter drugs and how they've changed. And then we'll look at some categories, some of the most used over-the-counter drugs, what they contain, what they do, the positives and the negatives. So we'll go over that next time, and I will see you then.